Good.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. This is Agential Topics. Agential Topics is a monthly meeting sponsored by Talking Octopus, which is a nonprofit organization founded in Vermont to build a physical model of agential biology. And to further that mission, we are trying to discover what agential biology is. And so we're hosting this discussion with the help of all of you guys as collaborators. So this month we have Judith Rosen, who is the world's foremost expert on her father, Robert Rosen, who was a groundbreaking theoretical biologist and mathematician who brought really new ideas or expanded on some ideas that came from Nicholas Reshevsky, but applied them in a really new way to think about causation in biology. And that's what we're all about. So I will let Judith begin. She has a presentation, and then we'll go on with a few questions, and then just have a discussion in whatever form we see fit.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Judith.
Yep. So share the entire screen, and then
Yeah, you guys remember to mute yourselves, and if you don't, I will possibly mute you myself. So keep that in mind.
okay. So this. Oh, now it's disappeared from where I was. How come? Why is it? Um. Why is there? It is.
Looks like you're sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, but where is it? It's behind this. Oh, for fuck's sake. Well, this is interesting. I can't seem to get at it. It's behind the.
In a different window.
Yeah, where is that?
Yeah.
Because that's it. There we are.
Perfect.
Okay, so there's a there's
Maybe
more.
expand it a little bit to fill your screen if you can, but if not, go ahead.
Uh, I can do that there, and
Nice.
then to go towards the next is that way. Okay. Um, this presentation isn't going to cover everything that he ended up developing or discovering through his career because you guys are interested in the agential aspect of biology. So, anticipatory systems theory is that. I mean, it's fully explains it and why living organisms are different from other material systems. So, um, the other aspects of his work that he discovered, I'll touch on after this presentation, and then we can discuss the whole schmear. Um, but an anticipatory systems theory, it's this peculiar pattern of biological behavior that you can find, he said, at all levels, at the cellular level, at the intercellular level, at the single cellular level, at all the way up to life and mind of a human being. Um, it becomes far more understandable, not only the typical behaviors, but all of the dysfunctions which the modeling relation ends up generating. Like the error signal in particular is a huge aspect of life. And the modeling relation diagram, and this is taken from one of his books. It's not very well drawn, in my opinion. It's one of those things that the art department put together, and it's very rudimentary. But um, on the causal side, what he's really talking about is causal entailment, and on the inference side, he's talking about inferential entailment. And entailment, as I will talk about in the next slide, is a concept that he felt science, the whole activity of science is based on trying to understand entailment. And we use causality to get at it. But when you use a model, so N refers to the natural system that you're interested in, and arrow number 1 refers to its causal entailment. So what makes it the way it is? Encoding, most people get in terms of you're going to build a model, which is F, the formal system. Arrow number 3 is what you encode into it to represent the causal entailment of the system of interest. And that's the inferential entailment. And then the final arrow is checking the predictions that your model generates about the system against what the system actually does. And he said, there's a lot of information in this diagram that is not obvious. And he took me through it and pointed some of these things out. For example, from within the natural system, there's no awareness or actual interaction between it and any of the other aspects. So encoding, the inferential entailment is separate from it, and the decoding, it's doing its own thing and it is not participating or aware. From within the model, you can't see the other, the number 1, 2, or 4 either. You only are aware of 3. And that becomes kind of important later. Because when you're, if you're living inside your mental models and you conflate them with reality, that's a problem. So it also doesn't tell you how to encode a model that will be able to predict the behavior in a future time or future circumstance. So this whole diagram represents a great deal of activity, and we have to figure it out ourselves how to do it right. But it is the only relation, if the model does decode and its predictions do match, this is the relation within which you can rely on a model. And so some people have suggested that this represents also the whole activity of science. What my father said about this relation is that it embodies a law of nature. It's not a law of science, it's a law of nature. He felt that it was entailment that must exist in the universe if we make use of it in science. And he felt that it is built into all living organisms as part of how living organisms navigate. And that's why this modeling relation is really critical. It's not just about science, although it has a lot to say about science, but it has to do with life and mind. So he said an anticipatory system is one which carries encoded models of self and environment within its own organization, which it then uses for system guidance and control. So it has to have information that's encoded. It has to be able to access that and use that to apply to incoming sensory information. So it's sort of the signature of life, really, this anticipatory pattern, because the only thing that you can be sure life does that other systems don't do, even ecosystems don't do, is preparing for some change that has not happened yet. And maybe it's a seasonal change. Maybe it's the day and night cycle. Maybe it's something else about their native environment. But they have a sort of calendar built in of their environment that tells them next phase from current phase or from past phase or whatever. But they get ready for the salmon run before the salmon start to go upstream. They get ready for winter before temperatures are getting anywhere near freezing. Trees go dormant long before it gets cold. So, you can just, the examples are too many to count. But it's not prescience or prophecy that they're using to navigate, because you can see these are predictions from the error signal. And I'll talk more about that as we go along here. And it's interesting also to point out that it doesn't take a mind to do this. All living organisms do this, all species, single-celled organisms, viruses do this. And that's how I argue that they are absolutely alive. They are just dormant until they activate. And we'll talk about that a little further into this as well. But it is also true that human beings have evolved almost really a second anticipatory system within the first. So there's somatic anticipation, like with our immune system, for instance. And then there is mental anticipation, and they both use encoded models. And my feeling is the conscious mind runs on models because it evolved out of life. It evolved within life. So there's this, by the way, this presentation is not all these dense written slides. Only the first, say, 8 of them have much written on them, and the rest are kind of more showing instead of telling. But these are certain aspects of anticipatory systems, also known as living organisms, which are always true. And every single one comes into being with certain fundamental models or values upon which all their other models are based. The most fundamental is the self model, whatever that happens to be. If it is a multicellular organism, every cell has the self, the multicellular self. If it's a hive type insect, then it's a collective self. It's interesting to see that when some species reproduce, their self model seems to change to be offspring. And then all of their activity goes towards protecting the health of that self. So it's a useful and interesting way to kind of analyze the multiple different ways that living organisms have evolved their self model. I also feel that the error signal will, as we will talk about a bit later, comes up with multicellular self with cancer. A cancer cell, from an anticipatory point of view, is a body cell that now has an individual self model, and the rest of the body is now environment. And it's raw materials. It's a source of what it needs. So it's no longer protecting the multicellular self. It is protecting the individual self and reproducing itself that way. The next most fundamental is the model that represents health, which is obviously based on self. And I usually put it health of self, because if the self model changes, the value for health changes with it. Then there's the whole spectrum of models I call the optimality scale, which are logically based on the first two. And they evaluate incoming sensory information. Every single living organism has some mode of gathering up information from its environment. Even a virus has that. And then it recognizes its host when it meets one for the first time. And if it meets something that is not a host, according to its encoded models, then it does not activate. And so you have all these viruses that will only infect certain species or certain individual kinds of prey, that they need to use for finishing their own organization and reproducing. But they know it when they see it, when they come into contact with it, when they sense it that way. So Here's a little sort of side issue of the difference between entailment and causality. And a lot of people have trouble with entailment. They don't quite get what it means. When you're talking about this entails that or is entailed by that. My father talked about science as deduction. He said, you can do a lot by taking some proven fact and saying, in order for this to be true, what must be true to make this true? And you can also go the other way and say, because this is true, what does it make also true? So that's entailment. That's following the logic of what entails what is entailed by what. But entailment itself is something that we need to get our heads around, because the universe carries all of these, we call them laws, laws of science, laws of nature. But does our mental model or our scientific model capture those laws properly? We've seen many times where it didn't. And so what we really want to understand is the entailment. We're trying to get at what these underlying laws are. And my father contended that there is no such thing as supernatural, which is an event occurring that is not entailed, right? An unentailed event, something that goes against the universe's entailment. That's what supernatural means, according to his definition. And he said, if anything happens in the universe, it is entailed. It cannot happen if it's not. So causality is the way that we try to observe what the underlying entailment is. And what could happen is much bigger in terms of a category of what could happen is bigger than what does happen. So this is what the modeling relation helps us with, but it's also something that is entailed by the universe. So his definition for information was a little bit different from any other one, and it's based on biological behaviors, because he contended that information does not arise until life arises, because life has health and self. It needs information, and anything that can be the answer to a question requires the question asker. It sort of implies that there is this entity that exists that needs to know or needs to have the information to feed into its own model. So the sensory capacity is the means for asking questions and seeking answers. The whole practice of being a model-based, model-guided system is to navigate according to health of self. So everything that we come into contact with and perceive is potentially information. If we do not have senses to perceive something, it's invisible to us. And obviously, that's not information to us unless we figure out that other organism species can see it or perceive it in some way. And then we develop a technology that allows us to, that's how they are sensing. They can see heat, or they can use echolocation or whatever. And we can then make it so that these things are visible to us also. And then it becomes information. So information and life are inextricably linked. Now, once we evolved our mental capacities and became basically a dual anticipatory system, a whole bunch of issues arise. I mean, it makes things possible, but it also causes a lot of potential for dysfunction. Most species don't have a central nervous system, and therefore no brain, no mind in the human sense. They have only somatic anticipation. But even the most simple forms of life that seem to be somewhat incomplete until they infect another individual and activate. The recognition is a model-based activity, and it often goes wrong. And our immune system is a very rich source of examples of this, that the mind is not directing or controlling in any way. So I will have some pictures of things like that. Intelligence, I think, was nature's or evolutionary response to all the mass die-offs. I mean, it seemed that an organism species that only has somatic anticipation cannot recognize when their environment is changed beyond what their models have encoded. And so they have no choice but to follow the directions that are coming out of their models. But that is a particular danger. When environment changes too fast for most species encoded models of it, they are in peril. And that is one of the reasons why rapid global climate change is so dangerous, because each species that is removed from an environment accelerates the rate of change for all the ones that remain. And it's only a matter of time before nearly all are impacted, and potentially in lethal ways. We don't even really know what we rely on. We know we need all the stuff in the gut zoo, for example, but we don't know for sure all the species that we need. We know that the gut zoo is what makes vitamin K, for example. We can't make it, but the gut zoo does it for us. And if some essential species disappears from all human beings, I don't know quite how that would happen, but we get colonized somehow. And if there's no more left, or if it becomes very rare, I think this could become something that could negatively impact human health, and it would be very, very difficult for us to figure out, especially if we don't involve anticipatory systems theories in our medical science. So it seems to me that intelligence offers up a way to recognize error in real time as opposed to evolutionary time, and build workarounds that protect life and health. Our capacity for imagination and creativity allows us to reinvent all kinds of things that would not work anymore. And it should, help us to predict the future better. So far, we see right now, especially in my country, what we're seeing is that the capacity for dysfunction is like off the charts. But hopefully, in the grand scheme of things, we will overcome our anticipatory dysfunction. So I did touch on this a little bit already. One thing that does happen in science and in life is that everything changes. Change is kind of something that you can predict. Everything is going to change and be accurate, which is why I think intelligence has arisen. But it does mean that even a model that was accurate and that decoded perfectly will eventually not do that. And he called that phenomenon temporal spanning. And a model that no longer represents the system because the system has changed over time, he says it's temporally spanned. So when you run across those terms in his writing, that's what he's talking about. He hypothesized that aging, or senescence, of a multicellular organism is caused by the collective effects of all these models being in error and still navigating. I mean, our immune system does not have the option of recognizing that peanut proteins are not dangerous to life. I mean, it goes berserk. I have a sibling that's allergic to peanuts, and just the tiniest amount can kill him. It's like kryptonite. And that is an error. It's a recognition error on the body's part. But we can't make it stop with our mind. The mind does not have that level of control. So it behooves us to really get to know how these models work, how we can induce tolerance to our immune system, how we can reset a self model if we are verging into autoimmune territory. I mean, this is something that medical science could do a lot with if they started to approach it from this kind of framework. And now we get into more fun things. So recognition error, like what my sibling does with peanut proteins, happen in the body and in the mind. And there's nothing more disorienting than realizing things aren't the way you thought they were. We do that a lot. And it certainly becomes when you get your somatic models kind of interacting with your mental models, you can start to see all kinds of bizarre stuff happening. Optical illusions are fun because they show us the mistakes that our brain keeps making. It tells us things that aren't true. And we start to see all kinds of things in nature that look like something else to us. I particularly like the skull seed pods of the snapdragon flowers. But it's interesting also that the internet is starting to manifest some of our pareidolia behaviors and see faces where there aren't faces, or see human things where there aren't. You know, like the orange with the woman with a halo kind of thing. And I put the photograph of this caterpillar that has what looks like a snake head at one end, because you start to see that, oh, this plays into evolutionary entailment also. And I have written one of the papers that I gave to Charlie to share with everyone is, how does it play into evolution? I mean, mimicry and camouflage are two examples, but there's a whole lot more. And the fact that this caterpillar is trying to induce an error, a recognition error in, say, a predator, so that it won't get eaten, and the fact that it worked well enough that it just keeps getting more and more realistic over evolutionary time, that's something that science needs to start, recognizing and seeing, and then following, where does that lead. Another source of anticipatory dysfunction is when your mind tells your body something and your body reacts as if it's true, or your body tells your mind something and your mind reacts as if it's true. Sometimes we can make use of this, like with the placebo and nocebo effect, but most of the time it's bad news. Anxiety attacks. I know some people who have those, and they've described them to me, and it's your whole body and mind that get involved in it, and your heart is racing and you're sweating and you're just freaking out and you can't focus, and start hyperventilating and so on, over nothing. Something triggers it and they don't really know what. I have had post-traumatic stress disorder myself, so I know what that startle reflex is like. And the only thing that helped it was to go to a 10-day course of Vipassana meditation that I didn't think would work, by the way. I mean, I thought you needed the placebo effect for that to work, but I was wrong. So something about Vipassana meditation, the way it's taught through the Goenka group, is able to reset something in your limbic system such that that startle doesn't get triggered anymore. And that's worth studying. Then we have the whole conflating the map with the territory, and thinking that we can just apply our mental models to the world outside without doing any um, decoding, any checking. And you can see that a lot of these things are in the news every day. People are killing one another over these things. And the machine metaphor of Descartes was one that my father put his finger on as he was trying to understand what causes life. And I'll get back to that in a second. But this has been happening for all of human history, I think. Because information is so important to our mental models, propaganda ought to be illegal, I think. But who would do the checking, and how would you know? You know, it's a problem. But there is so much propaganda out there right now that I don't think we can trust mass media at all. And here is Descartes' little idea. He thought he was getting away from religion. I think that's what he thought. But you see how there's gears in this graphic? When you type human intelligence into a image search, you often get pictures just like this, and it's because of the machine metaphor. It's become a way of seeing the world that causes so much trouble. My father was uncharacteristically blunt in what he said about the machine metaphor. He said it's not just a little bit wrong, it is entirely wrong and must be discarded. He said that in life itself. This is what happens because of it. I mean, anytime we try to get scientific about anything, we start to build factories and we start treating the natural world like it's a machine. We'll treat our children like a computer and standardize their, test scores and turn them into little, to make sure, that you got your money's worth, etc. And so, unfortunately, this starts to become a prison that we can't see our way out of. And it's a repeating pattern. Um, when we start to say that we can come up with some artificial goal, we can externalize all the negatives and make them not part of our equation anymore, and start to turn these things into factories, it's no doubt we're going to run into the dysfunction of our own ideas. And when you have, you know, drug companies are funding a lot of the research that gets done at universities now, and they will only fund what will eventually lead to them making money off of it. And so, pharmaceuticals stop being about protecting health. They start to be about making the most money, and education stops being about learning, and so on and so on. I mean, the machine metaphor fingerprints are on everything that is going wrong in the world right now. And I saw this picture and I went, whoa, that's an anticipatory fail. I think it's also a Darwin Award, and we can only hope that we're not on our way to a human Darwin Award based on mixing up our mental models with our realities. So the warnings that come from this apply to science, but they also apply to our thinking. They apply to how do we approach syndromes like autoimmune behavior, which can kill you if you don't figure out how to put it in check. Usually it's a drug, and drugs have side effects of their own. And so what if we could access the self model and reset it somehow? This is the kind of thing that could cure all life-threatening allergies, cure all autoimmune syndromes, and make our immune system much more functional. It could get weaponized, though, which always gives me pause, but I won't help the military do that. They've occasionally come asking me to help them with various things, and I always say no. We need to build these warnings into our science and teach modeling, I think, as like as important as the scientific method that we teach. The scientific method came from Descartes mostly also. And you cannot always take a big complicated system apart like you can a machine. This is where it fails, and this is why we end up causing side effects. I mean, global warming is a side effect, right? And so this concept of anticipation, it's sort of like GPS. And you don't want to forget, if you're a living organism that has a mind, you don't want to forget that the map and the territory are two different things. The map depends on what the territory actually is, and we need to know what that is. And so we have to keep checking because change is the only constant. So this kind of picture, like if you type GPS fail into a Google image search, you will find some very entertaining but scary pictures, because there are landslides and roads are gone on very tall cliff edges and so on. And big trucks start following their GPS down narrow single lane roads and end up where they can't turn around or even make a tight turn, because the truck is too long and so forth. It's something that is worth maintaining our awareness of, constantly checking our models against reality. If we start stereotyping, we should catch ourselves and look at why we're doing that. I think that's the kind of thing that would help our species a lot. And so I'll get rid of this. And do I have to stop sharing? I don't hear you, Charlie. Let's see.
Yes, stop sharing.
Okay, so I'm stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
That was wonderful.
So the things that are not in there, one of the things he discovered was that causality is not just a building block issue. Like, we're always looking for the building blocks of life. And one thing he discovered is it's not about the building blocks. It's not about what they're made of. It's how it's organized, which is why he said, and Reshevsky agreed, throw away the matter and keep the organization, because there is a definite organizational aspect to causality. And you can see it in very simple things like sodium chloride, for example, which is nothing like sodium or chlorine, which are two toxic elements. And yet sodium chloride is necessary for human life, but only in the right dosage. And dosage is another aspect of complexity that this kind of take it apart to study it approach loses. You never do understand dosage. You don't understand the impact that the relations between interacting parts are actual components of that interaction. And we can't see them because they're non-material, but they are essential, because if you just change one little relation, like distance or time signature or something, it can change the outcome completely. And what he finally concluded is that it's the organization that causes life. It's the organization that causes anticipation. It's the organization that gives us self and health of self and a whole way of navigating. And that led me to also, I was looking at the four different groups of thought for living organisms. And in this way, I see that my father's work doesn't quite fit in any of those four, because he felt that final causation, as the four categories of Aristotle's causation, final causation is the most important in biology. And he once used a house as an example and said, if we ask, why does this house exist? The formal category is the blueprints. The material causation category is what it's made of, the wood, the bricks, the mortar, the nails, whatever. The efficient causation category is the builders who built it using the blueprints and the nails and so on. But the reason the house exists is because somebody needed a place to live. And that's the main driver of a lot of what humanity does and living organisms in general. So that was outlawed because it looked like the finger of God in physics, because non-living organisms or non-living systems don't have this. They don't have an internal value for self or health of self. So final causation doesn't really raise its head until you're dealing with biological systems. And then it's like the most critical category of all. It explains all the other ones better. So those are things about his work that, need to be, I think, considered when you're trying to figure out where it fits. I mean, the reason you can say that the whole is more than the sum of the parts is because organization can change the nature of all of these components. They don't longer behave the way they do when they're separated from the system. They're, even with a molecule, the chemistry is completely different. The behavior is completely different. So things like synergy could never be explained by treating everything like a machine. It does not happen unless you have interactions according to certain kinds of relations. So those are some of the notes that I made as I was reading your email. When I talk about organization of a system, that's another one that's like entailment seems to really confuse people, and it's probably because I haven't come up with a succinct way to say it yet. But it includes not only the material components, but all of the relations, all of the interactions, all of the outcomes of interactions, all of the cycles of interaction that are like subcomponents themselves, feed forwards, feedback cycles, or what have you, interrelations with environment, multiple aspects of time, and of course, information is all part of a human being's organization as a living organism. And when you consider body heat is a component, obviously, of our physiology. It's very tightly controlled within a very narrow band of temperature, less than 10 degrees. And yet, as Pedro Marquez Zacharias pointed out, there's no gene for it. There's no gene for body heat. There is no gene for electricity either. And yet we are making our own electricity all over the place in our bodies. We use ion pumps to do all kinds of electrical things. The heart makes its own electricity. The brain makes its own electricity. It's just part of what makes us who we are, and without it, we would not be. So these are aspects that would seem like just unimportant side effects to metabolism and repair, which are the two functional activities that my father said all living organisms must have: metabolism and repair. And they are anticipatory, by the way, but they're non-separable. You can't fractionate one from the other, because repair is part of metabolism and metabolism is part of repair. So MR systems, he called them. It's the most you can reduce a living organism. And he said it's a relational model. It's not a physical model or a specific model. It's one that illustrates and can predict certain aspects of all life. So those are useful bits of the things that he kind of stumbled onto. I mean, he used to tell me things like physics still has flaws in it that nobody's dealing with. Einstein pointed out a whole bunch, and they were not very happy with him for doing that, but they got their heads around it, right? Well, he didn't quite finish the job, and now these mistakes are being built into quantum theory. So he said there are no states in nature. That is a model-based thing. It does not exist in nature, so it doesn't decode, right? And yet we use it and it's being built in as like wave equations, I think he said, in quantum theory, because it was in physics and we still use it all the time from state to state to state, as if it's like a motion picture is a bunch of photographs that you run together and it looks like motion. But he said time is always flowing through. You cannot, take it apart. It doesn't come apart. So these are issues that nobody's really looking into, and I keep bringing them up because I'm his daughter, and people don't like it when they get brought up, and I don't care. I'm going to bring them up anyway because they need to be said. Some things need to be said, and nobody can hurt my career, so I don't care if they're happy with me or not. But I think that was, yeah, I think that's what all the notes that I made based on your email and the stuff that was not in that presentation that have to do with complexity. Complexity is an organization based designation. So, yeah.
That's
so, questions?
Yeah. So before we jump in, people have their hands up, and I'm sure all of us in this group have 3,000 questions for you. I wanted to first just the basics here. So in the Rosen scheme,
Mm-hmm.
an organism is a set of models, causal models about the world.
It has a set. It is.
Okay.
That's not all it is, but it
Okay.
has a set.
It has a set, and
Yes.
those models are formed. They're relational models. They're not material. They're
Well,
the way
some of
that
them are. I
material
mean,
relates to other material in terms of components, right?
yeah, but nobody has investigated this. This is a whole area of science that could really use some PhD students to go in and say, because for example, how these models are encoded is different depending on where in a human being anyway. I mean, we have DNA and RNA, which is encoded information, not just genes that code for proteins, but how to build itself is all in there, right? They used to call all that stuff junk DNA. But in order for a single cell to turn into a human baby that can live outside the womb,
Right.
it not only needs, how to code these proteins, but when and how to construct everything. I mean, it's
Right.
just
And that's explanatory. So,
right. So
so
it's navigating through
yeah.
that process.
So my question though is about the limit of the agent. So he says life is defined as being close to efficient causation, which I read that as it's its own agent. It's not
It
a
makes
part of
itself.
it's
Yeah.
not a part of another agent, and it's not an instrument being used by another agent. And
Well,
it's
that's not
also,
always true. No, no, no. That you're taking it farther than he did. He
okay.
he
I think
said,
I think I'm making a mistake.
yeah, because his was purely the Aristotelian causal categories. So efficient causation relates to the workers that build the house, and say with a human fertilized egg, it builds itself. It has all that information, and the mother is not directing it. You're just protecting its ability to do that, right? And giving it raw materials. So it makes itself. It from within its own organization, it has the information to make itself.
So
So
I
that
think that's where I'm getting tripped up though, because so like a blood cell in
is
my
part
body,
of a, yeah, that's part of,
right? Is that a
yeah.
component of me, or is that its own? Is it
You
close to
know,
efficient causation, or is
if
it,
it,
or
yeah,
is
if it
my
develops its own
efficient
self
causation
model,
is a
then
tool
you're
of
in
it?
trouble. Yeah, that's called blood cancer.
Exactly. So
Yeah. So
so how?
it's so the organization of a living human being, that's the boundary. Okay. That's within that boundary is where you would look for close to efficient causation. So it uses aspects of the environment, and I think people get tripped up there too, because
Right.
they think, well, you need the environment. Well, yeah, it's predicted to be there. Not only is it predicted to be there, but it's predicted to be all kinds of aspects to it. For example, I remember seeing it was a religious thing saying God is an artist. Look at how all of these patterns are the same: blood vessels and nerves and rivers, and and Dad said that's just the path of least resistance. That's a simple law of the universe that we make use of in our developing selves, right? It's something that happens and we make use of the fact that it happens. So it's not reliant on some outside force directing anything. It's just simply it's the path of least resistance in terms of developing blood vessel path. And that, lightning too is another one. It made more sense that way to understand, that's why we see all of these seemingly, in non-living systems, you start to see aspects that look suspiciously like life or behave suspiciously like magnets and so on, that try to aggregate and whatever. It's not the same thing. It looks like it, but it's not. So when you're looking for what makes a human being a human, what causes you to become one, this is one area where we actually can watch it happen, right? With most, like with the origin of life question, unless we can figure out how to trigger it or catch it happening, because I think it probably keeps happening, right? On Earth anyway. We will never for sure be able to answer that question. And I talked to Stuart Kaufman about this because he's really interested in this. And he did not like what my father has to say about it, because he said that complex systems have ontology and epistemology, and you can't get at one from the other. So it's different kinds of information in a complex system. Only in a machine can you do this, only in a simple system. Can you figure out how it came into being from studying it after it already exists? And so with embryonic development, we can study it as it's happening, and it's obviously very different from the physiology of a human being after it comes into being. Certainly, all the things that a baby starts doing after it's born are radically different from the whole embryonic process. And if my father was correct, and I think he was, that this is something that we can never verify or disprove. We don't have access to the information about how life started on Earth or what Earth was really, really like. They keep trying to, I call them primordial soup kitchens, where they try to throw things into a pot and stir it with what they think were the conditions of Earth back in the day, and hope that it will just start happening. And it never works. And it's partly because we don't know what triggers this, and we don't know how it assembles, and we don't know. We weren't there, so we won't be able to get at that information from studying life as it currently exists here. But he did predict that if life exists on other planets, it may look very different from what life on Earth looks like, because it will have encoded its own planet into itself, the way we have encoded Earth and its gravity and its atmosphere and its day and night cycles and so on into ourselves. And so he felt that if you want to see if there's life on other planets, you should look for signs of anticipation, because that's going to be the thing that will always be true of life, no matter where it begins or where it lives. So does that help at all?
Or if totally. Yeah, everyone's got a lot of hands up, and I know everyone's got a lot of questions. So let's just open up for discussion, and we'll ask our questions as we go, and we can interrupt one another freely now, and go for it. I think Wayne had his hand up first.
Okay.
Let me unmute myself. Yeah, how you doing? I've studied your father's work extensively. We talk to each other on Facebook and stuff. And you sent me a couple things that that were unpublished. I mean, there's really too much here to get. So, from my point of view, I have a great appreciation for Robert Rosen's work. I also see places where there's limitations, and part of that has to do with just what he bracketed out in his work. So I really agree with him about the idea that physics of open systems. So this is sort of one of the conclusions from life itself, would be something that includes the physics of mechanical systems. But
Right.
without, until we do that, there's an awful lot that's going to be beyond our grasp about life. One of the limitations generally is that there isn't anything much in the formalism. And I had this discussion with A.H. Louis too, about the embodied models are in the formalism, they're relatively rigid. So there isn't really a lot of room for updating.
Which model? Because you're getting a little.
Well, so what I'm talking about, in one point of view, so we can imagine, or there certainly is truth to the fact that organisms have, and cells, and even maybe subcellular systems do embody faster than ambient time models of aspects of reality, and this is how they predict and use feedback control. But in the formalism, there's, and this was actually one or two of the essays in essays on life itself. Your father kind of talked about this, and he just didn't really know how to deal with it, which is why it wasn't really included. Is that the models aren't really, they don't really change dynamically that much within the formulas. Like there isn't a way to change the model as conditions change. Which is,
you mean a living organism?
Yeah,
like with senescence and stuff like that.
Right, and living organisms actually, if you look at Mike Levin's work, Jesus Christ, they absolutely do. But we just in the category theory formalism that was used, at least that version based on small categories, it's not. So this is, for me, this is one of the limitations. I think we can learn a lot from it, but there's, of course, in any scientific endeavor, there's some limitations.
Yeah, I've heard that category theory has been expanded.
Oh yeah.
Pedro Marquez Zacharias was telling, because he brought his mathematician friend to a conference I went to in Mexico City this year, and he is trying to take the category theory much farther. He said there were things that you could not do with category theory when Dad was using it that now are possible.
That's true, and it's also, if you look at something like the memory evolutive systems framework, which was actually developed by someone who was a category theorist in collaboration with a doctor, they use much more of the deep theorems that were available, but you still have the limitations of the particular kind of category theory that was used. We have category theories up to infinity categories. You've not a billion ones, but now I'm talking gibberish because most folks are here aren't mathematicians and they aren't going to understand this anyway.
Well, I asked him also, as you know, there's a lot of mathematics in his books, but I asked him, what am I missing by not understanding category theory? And he said, you're not missing anything because I say it all in prose first. And then I say it in mathematics for anybody who wants to argue. So
I feel like his prose captured a great deal. Like you can learn a lot from, and the books you really should read are Anticipatory Systems, Life Itself, and the essays. I think most people probably could not read Fundamentals of Measurement; they'd still be okay. Yeah, that might be a slog for folks to read.
That's more for scientists, really.
Yeah.
Like, what should you measure so that it actually pertains to your system of interest?
Right.
And how do you measure certain things? If you can't quantify them, can you still measure them, and so forth?
Yeah, a couple things. So if you do read Life Itself, and when you do, for folks here, after the main, and essentially the book is a proof that complex, anticipatory, and living systems in that nested inclusion transcend the mechanistic framework of Newton and Descartes, which is really all physics as we know it. you get to some really interesting short conclusions. One of them was about protein chemistry. This gets overlooked a lot. We tend to think of, and here we're confusing the model with the territory, and honestly, it's not a very good model. We tend to conflate protein active sites with catalysts. Right? Well, a chemical catalyst, first of all, the components are generally organically bound. Nothing changes, but there is some chemical activity that goes on, during the reaction, and then the catalyst is returned to its state. What's going on in a protein is something completely different. The active site of a protein is formed by modalities that are kind of hanging off this giant thing, and they form a three-dimensional space plus a hydroelectric atmosphere that does chemistry. None of the chemistry that we know, none of the chemistry, no matter what kind of chemistry, all the organic chemistry, none of that stuff works this way. That's why organisms can do things at ambient temperature and pressure that we're nowhere near being able to do.
Yeah.
He also had a really interesting one about the fact that there isn't as much information in base pairing as we think there is. And there's a really good argument. This is like a little 4 or 5 page thing in life itself. There's just too much here to touch on, but I just wanted to point out things. So I'm going to let people.
Well, when you consider, they talk about prion diseases, right? Like mad cow and scrapie with sheep. And I recently was, it always happens when I'm looking up something else, but I was fascinated by a particular species of lichen, because it looks like oak leaf shape. And I thought, they found that this lichen is created by like 4 different species, a fungus, 2 bacteria, and an algae. And, and it creates the same leaf shape all over the planet where it lives, right? Well, then they discovered that it can kill prions. It can make them inert.
One thing about prions, well, I think it's kind of important. Yeah, so it's important to understand. Prions are
misfolded proteins. Yeah,
there's diseases that are based on prions, but prions are also a mechanism, an epigenetic mechanism in evolution, and they're also used semiotically within organisms in useful ways.
Yeah,
and they have a bunch of different functions.
And so a misfolded protein, nobody knows how proteins fold. First of all, my father said that the folded shape has to be somehow embodied or encoded into the protein sequence, because it just happens.
No, but it happens in an environment. If you most eukaryotic proteins, almost all of them, if you take them and you put them in a sort of a solution that mimics cell in terms of electrostatics and things like that, they don't fold unless there's chaperones there, and like heat shock proteins and various other structures. They won't fold into those native shapes. So it isn't, the information is not in the sequence. It's in the organism. A lot of these things,
it's got to be encoded in there. And the fact that the ones that misfold are absolutely useless is also interesting, because that is encoded in what it's supposed to do in the cell is the thing that is then impacted by a misfolded protein. So he talks about protein folding quite a lot, especially in essays, and it's worth going through that multiple times.
It's a problem I worked on a bit in grad school. One of many problems I worked on in grad school, and I came to the conclusion that we were just completely approaching it the wrong way. This is before I even read Robert's work. It's you can't get there from here. Like just looking at the sequence is not going. The information isn't there.
It's in there in some different way. And that's the other thing that we need to start looking into, because I do think, for example, the day and night cycles of Earth are encoded in our bodies. And the melatonin that circulates every night that we produce only in the dark, it has no feedback loop within our hormones, cycles and feed forwards feedbacks. The only thing that stops it is light hitting certain sensors in the eyes that are not involved in vision. And they are hooked up to the pineal gland in the brain. And they're starting to see that circulating melatonin does all kinds of things in the body. It regulates so many different parts of our immune system, for one thing. And they've called it now, it's an oncostatic hormone. And that, finding that out when I was trying to see how time is encoded in human physiology, and realizing that artificial light at night, it's not toxic to us directly. It's how it's interpreted by our models that is making it toxic. So it shuts it down. And blue light is the most efficient at shutting it down. Red light is the least disruptive. And if you were seeing blue light in our evolutionary past, it was morning, right? The sky is not blue unless there's light in it. And then you are getting blue light. And so for me, the fact that so many people have cancer now, even kids with their night lights all night long, I mean, the medical studies that I've been seeing just like make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And I can tell you that changed my behavior because I went and got light blocking window shades for every bedroom in my house. And nobody is allowed to have, their cell phone or any blue backlit alarm clocks. Nobody really knows this stuff. And it doesn't make sense except from an anticipatory point of view. So the cancer pandemic may be partly triggered by, all the slew of pesticides and chemicals and things like that. But we have ways to try to repair our own DNA, and we are knocking it down every night. I mean, they think that most people are deficient, chronically deficient in circulating melatonin at night because it's not about sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
We have the same shades on our windows too, and essentially from our evolutionary history, when you're ready, if you're a day active animal, the blue light triggers you to activity. So it disrupts your rest cycles, and the rest cycles, especially in the brain, are extremely important. But all your different cells originally, if you go back far enough in their evolutionary history, were free living organisms, and they still have that capacity. Like some of its work sort of shows it. So you're fucking with all different kinds of circadian clocks that are at every different scale when
nobody's talking about it. It just when they talk about but anyway, so
that's such a fascinating topic and one of my own pet topics. But I want if you guys don't mind, I'm going to call on Luke and see what his question is, and then we've got Joanna and Mary also have questions. Okay. I want to be sure we
cover everybody.
Try and include. Yeah.
By the way, I don't have to go anywhere, so I can stick around if you need to go over.
I have a hard stop at 3. I have to pick up my daughter. So.
Okay.
Charlie, I want to note that as usual, I put my question in the chat because it's easier for me than keeping it in my brain as I'm listening.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Luke.
Hi, Judith. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you and Wayne for some of that conversation that helped sort of cover maybe some context of what I want to ask, which is a pretty basic question. I'm going to ask it in a way that will seem a bit fuzzy, but I actually want as precise an answer as you think. And I imagine your answer is not going to satisfy me based on some of what you said. So just to say that.
Okay, that's a prediction, by the way. That's a prediction.
I do want to. I just want to know what's at stake here. So I'm trying to work out a way to say it, and one of them is, what is the explanatory theoretical power that the term model and encoding do that organizing doesn't? And I'll just explain that. That's the question. So I'm down with anticipation, and I'm down with organization and organizational function, which is interactional and relational, and it's it's the ongoing interaction of a organized body organizing itself in its environment such that it can anticipate and imply fluxes of materiality, the sun coming in out of the environment, water coming in and out, nutrients coming in and out, and so on, such that it can continue to live. And different organisms do it with different kinds of capacities and complexities. So I'm down with that. But what I want to know why you're wanting to add models to something that I think is already explainable with organization, which is, we could say, the organism is organized such that it anticipates what the environment can give it to keep going. For instance, and why do we need to say the way amino acid strings fold into proteins is modeled or encoded or represented somewhere in here, as opposed to saying the organism is organized in its ongoing interaction with the environment such that this happens? Well,
organisms predict behavior of their environment or behavior of themselves.
Well, we can see that observationally as humans observing other organisms. We have models, clearly.
Right. Yeah.
My concern is that we're repeating something of the mechanistic.
No, it looks like that.
But just let me finish this. Okay. By applying something that humans can do and scientists can do, which is have models of representations and maps of territories.
I get this question.
Saying that all organisms must have that. And so I just want to know, and I know that you've got quite a different view here, so I'm not trying to persuade you. I want to know what for you is gained by speaking of models that you don't already have by speaking of organizationality.
Because they're different things. So the organization of a living organism includes modeling.
I want to know what gained theoretically or explanatorily by adding models to this discussion. I know that.
Okay. Okay. So you don't want to know how that's related, but if you want to understand how organisms are always predicting their environment and sometimes getting it wrong, the only answer is models. I mean, that was my father's insight. He was at Robert Hutchins' Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions as a theoretical biologist, the only one there, by the way. And not sure if he would have anything to add to because they were trying to solve the problems of the day, none of which have been solved, by the way. So they were so interested in planning for the future. How can we achieve a better future for our progeny than we have right now, and so on and so on. And he started to recognize that this concept of planning, which is why I included that paper in the papers that I sent to Charlie. The concept of planning, he said, turns out to be innately biological. It seems to manifest even in single cellular organisms' behavior. And even, one of the reasons Darwin was able to infer a whole evolutionary process was because he noticed that the organisms within a certain environment were very well suited to that environment to such a degree that they maybe only could eat one kind of plant. That's food. And if that plant dies out, they're going to starve, sort of thing. So this aspect of building your environment into yourself, and then the aspect of using sensory capacity to absorb what your environment is doing and to work your way around all these changes that your environment naturally goes through. So it's only the cycles that repeat in a consistent way that get encoded, and the ways that they get encoded is not something he ever said how does this happen? All he said was, this pattern is a law of nature, and living organization has somehow built that pattern and made use of it. So John Kinnaman, who's a friend of mine, was interested in doing work on what I call the ontology of anticipation. He said, even if no other system is using modeling in its own organization the way living organisms do, that entailment obviously has to exist, taking that from my father's assertion that there is no supernatural thing happening in the universe. We don't know all the entailment that's possible, so we don't know all the natural things the universe can do, but we can say that it's entailed. So his work is all about, what does it mean that the entailment exists in the universe? And he started to sort of tease into a framework, the whole 4-quadrant idea of Aristotelian cause categories. And it's fascinating because he went back into ancient, like Persian and ancient Ayurvedic, Indian science, and found that they had a 4-quadrant system. And then along comes Newton and Descartes, and they eliminate one. Mm-hmm. But we're alive. The thing that kind of gets me is like, okay, science is a human construct. It's supposed to help humans navigate better than we would otherwise. I mean, my father actually came out and said that the reactive paradigm is universal. So living organisms, when their modeling navigation is not working, will react to something that's not predicted and die, right? I mean, if you take a actively growing sugar maple tree and put it in a freezer, it will die because it's not supposed to get cold until the days get shorter, and so on and so on. I mean, it has to have the progression to prepare for winter, to survive winter. When you put it in a freezer, when it's actively growing in summer, it will kill it. So the idea of this model-based guidance system explains both what organisms do well and also where they run aground. And we make use of this error capacity in the horticultural industry all the time. I mean, there's whole ways to make money off blooming Easter lilies in time for Easter, or poinsettias.
Judith, is it possible for the model to change without the organization changing? Maybe that's a better.
Yes. I mean, when you look at, say, animals that get stuck in a cave, the opening caves in and there's no way to get out, and so they're in total darkness, very quickly their offspring, the eyes start to not develop properly. They don't develop completely. They have to navigate without visual cues, and so the brain will change in relation to, I mean, you find this with people that have a handicap too, like their other senses will become more developed, which really means that their ability to perceive and then their brain's ability to interpret.
Doesn't that count as a reorganization?
Well, in some sense, we're always reorganizing, aren't we? I mean, but we're not like puberty. Puberty is a reorganization, but baby girls are born with their uterus and their ovaries and their eggs, and they're not going to use them for decades, right? I mean, it's stuff that happens before there's any possible use of it, that it's getting ready for that. I mean, babies are born with lungs that work with air. And this is kind of just a tip of the iceberg with looking at anticipatory behavior. But for me, the error signal is absolutely critical, because that is something that plays into predator-prey interactions to a huge degree, and it is not explainable any other way. It is making use of the error signal, and any organism that can induce an error in some prey or predator to make it easier to either catch and eat them or avoid being caught and eaten, or to get your your flower pollinated. I mean, there's some very entertaining examples of different species that make use of this. And I mentioned some of them in those 2 papers that I gave to Charlie that talk about evolution. So if you're just talking about organization, but you don't talk about what's part of the organization, you won't have a living organism. You'll have a different system. It has to have the modeling capacity, not just to write models, not just to interpret models, but sort of heritable models that you pass on to progeny. Because, like, my little brother, his 2 kids are allergic to peanuts. It's an epigenetic change that is heritable, which is bizarre when you think about an allergy being heritable, but it is.
Cool.
So these are the,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I've heard you say it has to be. I haven't heard why it has to be. But I won't push the point. I just want to link it to one of the sort of the underlying project that Charlie has in bringing this kind of forum together, is that if it is the case that all living organisms function with models and encoding, then one could be somewhat optimistic that one could use models and encoding to mimic or regenerate or model living because it's based on models.
Right.
I follow a bunch of thinking and philosophers who don't start with representational models for living organisms and say that you can work with process and interaction and organization to do all the explanatory work that the representational kind of models we want to do. But that aside, the stakes are high if one thinks or hopes to have a kind of cognitive first approach to living organisms, because if cognitive first assumes a certain modeling, it depends how you define cognition, but if one was assuming that it involved models and encoding, one could be optimistic. If it turns out that living systems actually don't fundamentally use models and encoding, but we as observational humans do, and have mapped it back onto living, basically.
That seems, we try to avoid anthropomorphizing, but I think it also causes a mind block.
It's a classic thing for humans to
but I see people saying that, for example, trees are intelligent, and I'm like, no, they're not. They are not intelligent. Not the way we define intelligence according to our own experience. They are anticipatory, and intelligence is anticipatory. So it looks like the same pattern because it is. And we make use of models in science because that is how our mind runs.
I guess another way of asking is, I don't understand then what a somatic model is that's not a cognitive one based on things. But I'll just leave it for now.
Well, wait. There's one example that might help you. With immune function, what are we doing when we're getting a vaccine, but teaching a new model of an organism that may try to invade? So our immune system creates its own memory. It encodes, right? It encodes a model of all the vanquished pathogens and any ones we get a vaccine for, and it stores it in the bone marrow. So we're not directing that process, and it has nothing to do with our own kind of encoded memory. It is definitely there, though, and you can see what happens when someone has a bone marrow transplant. They have to kill off all their bone marrow, and they get some bone marrow from a donor, but it doesn't give them enough protection, and they always need to get revaccinated for everything that they were vaccinated for before. And pardon?
That's a good example. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's a type of encoding, it's a type of model, and it could be studied because I'm pretty sure they would have access in the body to looking into how they may even already have gone that far. But it would be useful to look at it as a model for an encoding process, because that is one that our mind is not involved in, and we all do it. I mean, we don't direct our immune system, and most of the time we're not aware of what it's doing unless it freaks out and we start having symptoms of some kind. Right?
Quick comment since
Joanna,
Catherine's here. Just
Yeah.
real quick,
Sorry.
since Catherine has joined us, you know, she in her paper that she wrote called "Motion as Self-Regulatory Sense" back in 2014, you know, she details a lot of the physical mechanisms involved in emotion from the level of simple bacteria cells and some of the processes going on all the way up. These are actually good examples of embodied anticipatory systems.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, so Mary and Joanna have questions, right? So we should.
Yeah, I have Joanna next, and then Mary.
Okay, and then.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judith. I have two questions, very brief. I'm going to exclude Joanna from them. They are just to clarify views that I see in you that I see might conflict with how I understand your father's work. First one, you said viruses are alive. As far as I understand Rosen's work, the minimal requirement for an organism to be alive is to be an MR system. So that means
Metabolism.
closure and efficient causation. So a virus does not fulfill that criteria.
It does if you look at it differently. I mean, if you look at the host as part of environment that it needs and that it recognizes when it meets it and uses then to reproduce and to make more of itself, right?
But if we extend that boundary, couldn't we say that a gene is alive because it has the
No.
host of the cell to reproduce as well?
A gene by itself would not be able to do any of those things. A gene predicts a genome in a sense, such that they don't exist by themselves. It's encoded information about what it
They
will
do
become.
exist. I mean, you find DNA in old bones.
Right.
That's one of the reasons we can study Neanderthals and their genomes. I mean, you can have genes out there,
But it wouldn't.
they just are not able to reproduce without the machinery around them. And same with viruses, they are just more complex. So as far as I understand, the virus is not an MR system by itself.
It is, because you can have a dead virus. You see, the virus is dormant, but it predicts a host.
And so what would be a dead virus?
And a dead virus is just going to compost, right? It's like a seed in a way. A seed is alive for a certain amount of time, but if it doesn't encounter the conditions in the environment that it predicts will be there, that it needs in order to sprout and grow, it will eventually die because it runs out of internal information or internal energy, and then it collapses. I mean, the organization collapses. So there is such a thing as a dead virus, but there's also an inactive live virus. So if it doesn't, let's say a rabies virus meets a warm-blooded bird, it doesn't infect it, even though it's warm-blooded and that's what it seems to need. But it doesn't recognize a bird as a host. But as soon as it comes into contact with a mammal, it activates. And that is encoded in the virus. It's not something exerted from outside.
That's a very interesting question to me, because you also said about eggs. They have all the information. What the womb does is all about protecting. That's not how I
Providing the
see it.
environment, yeah. Mhm.
That's not how I see it. There is information in the womb. The womb is, in fact, one of the things we have not been able to replicate by hook and by crook. There's information in the womb. It's
Like
about
what?
that exchange. And the same with the protein folding that you guys broached here. It's about what's in the environment. It's about that exchange. And this boundary between me and non-me, self and non-self. It's a very interesting part of life that I think we are still trying to understand. But Rosen helped me with MR systems and closure and their efficient causation. So that was why my question, but we can leave that one to the side. The second one is more interesting to me in particular, which is you said that you don't think that the origins of life will ever be decipherable. As far as I understood Rosen's view, he was just extremely pessimistic about reductionist approaches, as many of us are. However, many people are working actively with other approaches, not reductionists, in the origins of life. I was one of those. So I wonder, and I worked with Kaufman as well. Kate is here. I worked with Stu for several years. I also didn't think that was his view. So I wonder how you got that view.
I mean, it was my father's finding with complex systems. So not even just living, but complex systems where ontology is a different kind of information from epistemology. So it doesn't subsume. You can't get at one from the other. And he said that this will always be true with complexity because it's about, once it comes into being, it has certain properties and capacities. But if it hasn't come into being yet, then it's all the components and whatever. You know, this organizational boundary is something that needs to be studied because, for example, we know that there are countless systems that are make part of us and that we ourselves are then a component in other systems, right? And yet there's a boundary that matters. And what's inside the boundary is organized and has its own self value or model predicted within this boundary, this organization. But we can then be used to, you know, like a larger system could use us as a component, like in the matrix of a battery, you know. I mean, we weren't being who we are when we were just plugged into this cells of this battery, right? And we feel it even sometimes when we're in like a big group of people. If you tend to be a herd follower, I mean, the behavior of a mob is something that has been very difficult for science to get any kind of to grapple with in any meaningful way. And I think it's the organizational aspect, the fact that when you are a component of a larger system, you change your own behavior based on which system. So whether it's an army platoon or being in the audience of a symphony orchestra, you change how you talk. You change, you know, you try to suppress a sneeze or a cough. You try to, you turn your phone off, you know, things like that. I mean, there's a bunch of different behaviors. If you go to church and you're in a congregation, it's another thing. And in an army platoon, you are part of basically a machine we've created to protect or to kill enemies, right? To protect a country. But people have said that they don't know why they behaved the way they did when they were like, that's part of the thing that causes so much pain to returning service people, is because they were forced to act in a way that was inconsistent with their own personal beliefs. But they were taught that in order to be in the army, they have to follow orders, keep the chain of command, and so on and so on and so on. And that just doesn't really work very well with our conscience, you know, with our ideas of how we want to be in the world and making the world better than it is, and so on and so on. And I think that's all because organization can impose really a pretty powerful behavioral kind of.
Right. Sorry if I just try to take us back to the topic of origins of life, because it's one I'm very passionate about, and very quickly say, I think any theory in science is never 100% true, right? We just test it and test it and test it and test it until it doesn't fail, never. So we are very happy with it. So we have one, for instance, for the origin of the eukaryotes, which is quite widely accepted, which is it happened through the symbiosis of a prokaryote of 2 prokaryotes, 1 bacteria and 1 archaeum, that we are quite happy with, most of us. So why couldn't we have such a theory for the origins of life that we tested sufficiently, that we saw emergence to the
Well,
degree that we're happy with?
people are welcome to try, but how will you know?
They are paid to try also.
Yeah. I mean, the way that they tend to try to create artificial life and artificial intelligence is to simulate it, right?
Oh, yeah. Those are different, very
Yeah. But if they
philosophical.
succeeded, say, if they succeeded in creating a true artificial intelligence, a true artificial consciousness, it would also be artificial life, according to my father's work, because it would be an anticipatory system from within its own organization, and that's really the crux of it.
So that's very interesting. I have to confess, I haven't read Anticipatory Systems. I just read this one, which is like my Bible.
Mhm.
So I probably need to read Anticipatory Systems. For me, the minimal requirement is constraint closure, and so I keep having a foot on the ground with the material components and metabolism and
Right, but metabolism and repair are both anticipatory functional concerns being directed by
correct. But an artificial
health and health.
intelligence is not self-sufficient in its metabolism, and it's
No, certainly not the way they're making it. Yeah, the way they're making it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway,
but
thank you
that's
so
all.
much. I don't want to take more time. Thank you so much.
So
Great.
Mary,
I would like to offer that Catherine should go next. My questions are in the chat, so anyone who isn't terribly interested in my questions,
yeah, we can talk.
you should ask Catherine first.
Okay. So Catherine, hi there. You're muted. I can't hear you. You're muted. There you go. Nope, it's muted again. How did that happen? Charlie, do you have?
She's unmuted now.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi. Oh my gosh. This is wonderful. I'm sorry I joined you late and woefully unprepared, but I have heard wonderful things about your father's work, and I'm married to Stuart, and I make some of the same points about ontology and epistemology. But oh my God, there's so many layers of questions to ask here. What you are describing as an anticipatory system, I have described as the little loop of mind that is enacted in bacteria in a little cybernetic loop that has both feedback and feed forward. But the one little coding that living systems have that may or may not be possible to build into artificial machinery is what I call the fundamental semantic information bit, which is the experience of something akin to pleasure and pain. And once you have that little bit of information, you're off and running. And so I have been arguing for a while now that the emotional system is in fact a sensory system. It is completely intimate with the immune system, with epigenetic modeling. I mean, this implies that epigenetics or pregenetics, something that was anticipatory and sensory motor oriented, came before the more complex encoding. So I'm totally on board. I've been wandering sort of lonely in that territory that your father said needs to be explained. And I just think this is fabulous. And I'm getting bolder and bolder about demanding that physicists and chemists like, look, there is a self, there is some kind of boundary condition that we need to understand. And that boundary condition is actually part of the environment. So if we want to start talking about fields and quantum mechanics, I think there's going to be a lot of really ripe territory there. But we've been talking about the environment, and I think that this whole issue of self and environment is absolutely essential, not only to biology, but actually to physics. And I've been poking around with in the laws of form, because when you want to talk about formal cause, Let's talk about what form is and the
Yeah.
foundational self-referential act of self-distinctioning. That is something at the very, very, very bottom of how we are, even an identity structure that can be both a part and a whole, bottom up and top down control. But what
That's
you
right.
would have heard you describing today in an MR system is exactly what I set forth about how emotion operates as a self-regulatory sense. And it is part of the self-organizing structure of a Kantian whole. And I've been kicking around this idea of a critical complexity architecture that that organization has to do with finding that optimal space of computation at the edge of chaos, and that through that this sensory mechanism that I'm arguing is inherent in life may go all the way to resonance. So I'm thrilled to hear what you're saying. I would love to I catch up on all the homework that I should be doing. And what are you doing now, by the way?
Well, that's a whole nother thing. I mean, most of my time is taken up with science writing and, attending conferences and talking about it. But before he died, I was almost ready to launch my fiction career. Fiction and art and comic strip and all of this stuff. And it's all sitting there, talking to me. But the only fiction I've written since he died was the story that got published by Springer. Surprised the hell out of me that they wanted to do it, but it was a short story that allowed people to meet my father as a person.
Where can we find it?
It's at the very back of the new version of Anticipatory Systems, but I can send it to Charlie and maybe he can distribute just the story.
That would be wonderful.
But it's a way for people to get inside his head a little bit and for him to talk. He's at the gates of hell. It's where it opens. Because he died, and he would love that. I know he would just love that. It's meant to be funny and sort of dark and not too precious. But he's talking to a non-scientist, namely Satan, about his work because that's why he was sent to hell, and so on. And so he ends up going back with the devil to his palace, and they are drinking some alcoholic beverage and talking about science. And my father, is explaining it with examples like what he used for me. So I'm paying it forward to anyone. And even in Mexico at the conference, some of the students came to me and said, I read your story that was in Anticipatory Systems, and it really helped me understand his work. I found it much easier to get into these ideas because of the way he explains that, But it was meant to be funny because, for example, he asks the devil, are you carnivorous? Because he has pointy teeth, right? He has pointy teeth. And so the devil's very nonplussed by that question. Like, nobody's ever asked me that. Dad's like, well, but there's no meat. Where's the meat here? Right? Why would you have pointed teeth if we're just disembodied souls? He wasn't trying to be obnoxious. He was just curious. But
I love it.
That was my dad. That was the way he was. So,
well, I'm really honored to hear both from you and all the lovely stuff that has been just filtered down. Stu and I started reading Life as It Is once when we got bogged down in the math, but
yeah, you don't have to read the math, just ignore it.
So the thing I just want to suggest here is this concept of the environment. And the environment in a Darwinian sense is a selector, but in my
father's sense, it's anything not self.
Exactly. But that's where I'm going with this. But that in Scott Gilbert, the developmental, he says that it's also an instructor, right? So we have a selector and instructor, and then we come up against some of the deeper ideas from quantum mechanics where the environment is a witness, which is central to some of the theory. So all of those things are actually contributing to our boundary, if you will,
Right.
are the self and not self, and indeed not yet self distinction. Because the emotional system is all about the self. It's been entangled too much with cognition proper and intelligence, but it's absolutely
Anticipation.
and it's evaluative.
Yeah.
So one of the revolutionary things I want to bring back is value in nature. And I'm even toying with the idea of subjective relativity.
Yeah.
Where do you guys stand on that?
Well, there is no such thing as objectivity from an organism point of view. You know, every organism's, whatever their self model is, that's the center of the universe, whether it's a hive self or an individual self or whatever.
Well, and that literally is the physical frame of relativity and motion within that frame. That's why I love these ideas from the laws of form, because it's this foundational distinction out of nothing that creates both a something and its backdrop, its reference frame. So,
but I think the fact that the universe is inherently interactive. There's local interactions, and then there's universal. Time and space are interacting, but local interactions can create outcomes that are radically different from anything around it, which is exactly what life is like, isn't it? So that's the boundary of each living organism is sort of a local context that it has created.
Exactly. Umwelt.
Yes. And it, not only is self encoded, but not self is pretty.
Yes. And in fact, that's the foundational comparison, is the self from not self that kicks off the little loop, the error signal. You're absolutely right. And so I was saying, that the affect is that error signal, but it's also connected to the behavioral approach and avoidant. And then once you have that, you have the learning. So,
and then cancer is much more understandable as a body cell that now has an individual self model and is treating the body like environment.
Exactly. And if familiar with Candace Pert's work, I mean, the emotion and the immune system are just so ancient together that anticipation and learning goes so deep. And I love your distinction between anticipation and what's being called basal intelligence now, because that's assumed.
It looks the same. It looks the same. It's got the same pattern, but it doesn't really help to say trees are intelligent. I mean, I'm a tree lover. I mean, I would rather, most of my friends could tell you, I would rather hang out with trees than people most of the time.
No kidding. No kidding. I'm a tree climber from way back.
Yeah.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I have one quick question. Was your dad interested in quantum mechanics at all?
He was interested in it, but he also felt the errors needed to be corrected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not useful. And when you run into a paradox, and he came right out and said, there are no paradoxes in nature. That is a model-based, entity, and it's a symptom of something wrong in the model. So when you ignore that and just use it where it works, and ignore where it doesn't work, which is what I see a lot of quantum scientists doing, that's dangerous. It's dangerous.
Well, what about Gödel, though? I think Gödel pointed out the limits of any formal system, because you're always going to have paradox. And I think that's actually a fundamental part of it, because with emotion, you have this sort of both and logic side by side with either or that's in time.
Yeah, well, he pointed out that there would in a complex system like mathematics, there would always be stuff you couldn't formalize.
Yeah. And that's so cool. That's because the agent is part of the machine. That's
complexity is capable of generating stuff that we can't predict, and quantification is only one way of measuring. Again, this is, it's fundamentals of measurement, but quantification runs aground with life all the time. There's so much about life that you cannot represent mathematically. And my father also came right out and said that. So even though he was associated with a lot of mathematics, he felt there were limits to what you could use mathematics to represent in biological symptoms. And love is one of them, and emotion is another. And you can see precursors to things like malice in organisms that aren't even capable really of malice, because malice requires you to know what will hurt another organism and do it just because, that's malicious. But when a Photurus firefly female who can't make her own, there's a chemical that most fireflies make that make them safe from predators, and her species can't make it, but she can eat it. So she flashes the "yes, I will, hello baby," signal to a different species, who then lands to mate, and she eats him.
Oh
And
my gosh, yeah.
and it sounds, horrific. They call them the femme fatale fireflies, but they're not malicious. They're not capable of that. But you can see that it's that little nugget of using some other species models and creating an error signal in order to get something you need. She's not thinking
absolutely
about ending his life. She's thinking about taking care of her offspring, that she's going to lay eggs and needs them to be safe. So
Wait, you just brought up the most important aspect of the emotional system, is that it is absolutely linked with approach and avoidant behavior. It's largely embodied and unconscious, but until we become conscious of the informational component and everything that it tells us about the identity and cooperation, which is actually at the bottom of everything.
Right.
Otherwise, people can get in your OODA loop. You mentioned the army and the military.
Yeah.
This inactive anticipatory loop of mind came before the complex basal intelligence, but it's what's called, the action perception loop. And it's also called the OODA loop in military parlance, where the more you are aware of your own, but let's see, you've got to observe, you've got to orient, you've got to decide and act. But if you're being conscious of your own is great, but when you're conscious of somebody else's, you can get into their OODA loop, and we do it all the time.
Oh,
in fact, what's going on in the world right now, and you say the model
propaganda
they're pushing emotional buttons, pushing anger, pushing fear, pushing disgust. And if we understood what those are really about, nobody could do that to us. So I'm kind of a revolutionary about this. And if you want to participate in a full-throated revolution, let me know.
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
Definitely. And then Mary, if he's going to shut this down, how shall we talk?
Would you be comfortable sharing your contact information with Charlie, and he can pass it on to me? I have very practical questions. I'm married to a farmer, and they come from a very common sense, intuitive, sort of, I think, very Rosen-like analysis of the systems in front of them. And he's very cross with me for all the cell biology that's now in his book.
Yeah. Well, that would be a huge thing to talk about, and we really need to,
because the most cursory examination of the climate models, which we don't really know because they're very secretive about what's actually included in them, and there's over 1,000 of them, indicates that there's vast swaths of life in living systems that aren't even considered. Or, for example, the mycosphere is considered as biomass only, basically just as matter. It's nuts.
And how much it weighs and stuff like
exactly
that.
It's by quantification of the carbon, the weight of it, and the acres that it takes up, whatever. And we really I have some very interesting insights to share with you that have come from the most cursory examination of these models from a systems approach. And now more than ever, I really need to understand Rosen. And I feel like even though it's outside my field, it's never stopped me before, I need to initiate the process of writing about the models from a life systemic critique. So I'd love to speak about with you more. And I guess I'm just going to copy these questions, since I can send them in an email and we can get started that way.
That would be great. I just put my email in there, and
okay, fantastic.
Send them to me directly, and I can look at them right now and sort of.
Okay, I'm so grateful for your work and for your dad's work. I was floored when I read the book, and I read Life Itself first, and I thought, clearly don't understand enough mathematics to be assuming that I understand this the way I do.
You don't need the mathematics. You
So
don't need.
thank you for
I
explaining.
have his word on that. I asked
Well,
him.
I just thought, and I really need to talk to you about recursion also, because that's very important when you're talking about climate models.
Mm-hmm.
Really important. And my husband, I'm so glad he didn't attend this meeting, because he thinks we're publishing the book in the next couple of days. And oh well.
And now you got to add some stuff.
Well, I think what I'm going to do is probably just let the book be published, and then work on this external critique, which some of the scientists, some of the regenerative farmers are actually ecologists, and they just don't dare to make any of these critiques because of the propaganda and the noise out there, as you know.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlie. This has been amazing.
Yeah, fantastic meeting as usual, leaving us all hungry for more.
That's good.
And thank you so much, Judith, for being our guest, and we hope you'll come back and join us as a participant.
Anytime. You let me know.
Wonderful.
Thank
we
you.
can talk about just one little aspect somewhere.
Yeah.
If people prefer, because there is a lot there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your email, and we can all join in that way too. So
okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Thanks so much.
Take care.
See you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.